Our guest today is Martin Bresson. He's Public Affairs Director at Invest Europe, the world's largest association of private capital providers. Martin leads the Invest Europe's advocacy work, representing the interests of the association's private equity, venture capital, infrastructure, and long-term investors. Previously, Martin was partner and group head of financial services at Ruth Peterson Public Affairs and was senior advisor at Fleshman Hillard in Brussels. He also spent a decade working at the Danish Ministry for Business and Economic Affairs, responsible for EU policies. We at BVCA, the Bulgarian Venture Capital Association, so I don't confuse anyone, we're talking about the other BVCA, which is the British Venture Capital Association. We, together with BVCA, of course, are an honorary member of Invest Europe. We work together quite often, even more often now, during our regular calls led by Invest Europe's team, by Martin and his policy affairs team, with other national associations across Europe, to discuss together what's next in terms of the current crisis and COVID, and what needs to be addressed on a policy level to the European Commission, as well as on a national level in regards to the venture capital and private equity industry. We started addressing the governments, the European Commission, in a series of letters and meetings, again, led by Invest Europe, but also on a national level by the different associations. And as we understand from the Trending Topics team, there is an interest in the policy matters in regards to venture capital investment and the SME factor, of course, that we're going to talk a lot about, the small and medium enterprises, especially the innovative and digital tech startups and scale-ups. How can we help them? How can we support them through the crisis via the existing financial instruments? So we were summarizing the liquidity issue and the importance of the SME definition, and why is that important? Why is that important, and why are we working on that so much, so that more innovative scale-ups and startups can take advantage of that, but also agreeing on the fact that we here on a national level, as well as other national VCAs, the venture capital associations, are also working towards advocating to already use the existing venture capital funds to support their startup scale up through the crisis. And here on a national level, the one institutional investor is by our government is the fund of funds, has been quite receptive on that and ease their requirements for private capital, and raising additional private capital is eased by end of this year. However, on the EIF side, which is the other institutional investor here in Bulgaria, we don't see that. We see the Escalar program that's been launched, another program to help venture capital funds in the crisis. However, from our perspective, we see that they have bigger tickets tailored to growth equity funds and private equity funds. Yeah. And here in Bulgaria, we have a smaller VCs compared to what's been had in mind for the Escalar program. So these are two institutional investors here in Bulgaria that are helping the venture capital funds, or trying to address the issue with COVID.
And I think on your point with the EIF, I think that's one of the illustrative examples of a feedback loop where, you know, we are almost not on a daily, but twice a week or a weekly basis in dialogue with or EIB, but hopefully helping them. Sometimes being a nuisance in putting market requirements forward, but that. And then our understanding of, okay, but how is this actually working, and creating that feedback loop between, you know, the situation in Bulgaria and in other countries, and then feeding it into, well, Brussels in my case, but Luxembourg in the EIF case. And for that dialogue has been I mean, I'm not going to claim it's been successful because we're not there yet, but it has been helpful. Also, I believe, to the EIF. I'm not going to say much about Escalar. I think I've said some things on Escalar off the record. No, I can say that, I really wish that the Escalar all the success in the world, because I think having a fund or a fund of funds for scale ups is a good idea. And I can see why there was this gap on a pan-European level in the European market. I think when sort of the message that we sent on a political level to the European Commission and others was, make sure that your instruments are apt for the current situation. And I think that Escalar is can be, right? It's a pilot project. It can possibly be very, very good for the need in the market, but I just don't quite see it as a crisis apt vehicle for investments. And also launching a pilot project in the middle of a crisis and then thinking that you can learn something general from it is something that, and I should state, this is not Invest Europe's point of view, it's maybe morely my personal point of view, but I do think it's I think you run more risk with the learning points that you'll have to take from this pilot project at a later stage than you'll take real learnings. But I hope I'm wrong. Let me stress that. I really hope that Escalar will be a success.
Yes. Martin, what do you think are some of the successful measures that's been taken on a European level in regards to the issues we listed, the liquidity, the problems for the SMEs and the portfolio companies of our members, the venture capital funds? Which are some of the successful steps?
And to be honest, on an EU level, I think it's easier to sort of, take a few notches in the belt when it comes to the regulatory relief and making sure that we clean the desk of things that our members shouldn't be, and your members shouldn't be bothered with. I think getting the state aid regime with the tweaks that we still need to do, but getting it up and running so that the member states at least could have the programs ready is a success. We're still working and pushing to get the EIB and the EIF to set up some venture and some private equity vehicles as well. So I think it's a little bit, I'd love to pat my own shoulder and say that, we've been successful on 10, 15, 20 issues. But things have happened. And I think everyone has been sort of blaming the EU for coming late to the game. But I think some of the money set aside, some of the magnitude of the help programs alone has sent a clear signal to the market, also to the private equity and venture market, that help is on the way. I think some of the things that we still need to do is we need to tweak a lot of regulatory details to get it absolutely right. And I think in the receiving end, and I hope it's different in Sofia, but what I hear from a number of places is that there's been a lot of promises made, there's a lot of programs that's been announced, but actually getting money in hand is taking way too long. And liquidity issue is not something where tomorrow is a day too late. So 2 months from now is a bankruptcy and a debt and unfortunately a debt startup away. So I think some of the unsuccesses, which is really difficult to work on from a Brussels perspective, but is to get the big promises into actually practically getting money out. And that's where I think your members and you, hopefully it's different in Sofia. I don't know, but there's a lot of work to be done still on the practical implementation. So thanks for asking me for my successes, and then I was unable to celebrate that many of them, but it's kind of the destiny sometimes of a trade association, is that you make a lot of small nudges that you can't really say are great successes, but together it puts some momentum in the right way. And I think that's kind of where we've been. And we'll also get over some of the obstacles that are still there, like the SME definition and parallel issues on called undertakings in distress, which is again one of those EU definitions that may hamper payments to venture capital, particularly private equity backed companies by comparison to others, because of the way debt can be structured.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And Martin, you work with other national associations as we discussed previously. Invest Europe is the umbrella association of other national associations, bringing us together. Do you have examples from other member states where they've been particularly successful in addressing or implementing even support for SMEs, their financial instruments in regards to private equity and venture capital?
I think the good example that we kind of all lean on is France. Actually, France has been very successful in making sure that the government made some clear promises on guarantees that the banking sector could then lean on, and then they committed and actually set up systems to make sure that these systems were functioning and payments were being done. And I think France is probably one of the better examples. Slightly peripheral, maybe from Bulgaria, but Finland has been doing. It's my understanding. I haven't been to Helsinki for ages, but but my understanding is that things are moving forward in a pace where you say promises made, commitments made. The commitments are actually turned into real money. Real money is paid out, and those 4 steps are executed on in a fairly quick way. I think the learning point. I mean, and again, maybe too early, but I think the learning point from a policy sort of, if you take the helicopter perspective, is, and possibly mirroring the thing that you were saying before about how your state fund, they're used to interacting with you, and therefore they were quick in adapting to the crisis situation. I think if you take sort of a macro perspective on that, France has probably been a very good example because France had all the administrative systems and the focus on venture capital. There's been a program from President Macron to France should sort of reinvent their venture environment. So I think those countries where there's been culturally, but also administratively and politically, a system already in place or a will, those countries have been those where it's been, and nothing has been easy and smooth. But those are probably the countries where it appears from a Brussels perspective they've been doing the best.
Yes, absolutely. That's very important to know. So we're gonna look for their next steps as well. What measures are being taken to support fundraising efforts of the fund? This is clearly one of the very important questions from not only our members, but a lot of ecosystem players here in the country as well as regionally. From your perspective, what are those measures?
So which funds are you talking about? So
in general, for all, because currently all we hear and we see there's a lot of internationally private equity and venture capital funds are interested in how the next fundraising process is going to happen, right? So do you think that the crisis would affect that, and what measures are or should be taken to support the fundraising efforts in the years ahead?
It's a super good question, Maria, and to be honest, it's one of those things where you're almost ahead of where I am, or where we are right now, right? Because there's a number of things that need to be resolved almost in a crisis mode, right? Right now, it's about making sure that those funds that are up and running gets to closure, and are there anything politically, regulatorily that hinders a closing of those funds? Is there something we need to change in the closing of the existing funds? When you look more long term on the fundraising, I think the expectations in the market is generally that, and maybe wrong, that we'll fall back to a situation of sort of commercial normality, and fundraising is going to be as difficult or as easy as it always was, slightly, probably, hopefully easier in the perspective that private equity and fundraising has been perceived as more important this time around than in the last financial crisis. So I think that goes for Bulgaria as it goes for Brussels. There's an alertness to the need. But the policy initiative that's directly aimed at facilitating fundraising, not so many.
Yes, so we're trying to cope right now during the moment, and we will think about the future after we're done with addressing the current needs.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the. I mean, much as this conversation is pleasant, let's not ignore that there is a crisis going on out there, and a lot of the activities that we're doing are basically managing. You're jumping from ice flake to ice flake. But I do think the outlook for sort of post-crisis mode will settle in a way where there's a better understanding of private equity and venture capital needs. I think maybe here is also a sort of, you look 10 years back and you see how the venture market has not just, increased in Europe, but also proliferated into countries where, venture capital culture was basically unknown 10 years ago. So I think there's a healthier foundation for addressing issues of, what do we do about fundraising? How do we proliferate sort of public fundings that are out there? How do we make sure? But facilitating fundraising, we have some few notches about pushing for allowing banks and insurance companies to invest more in not just in private equity but also in funds and private equity. We hope to be successful on those regulatory work streams as well. But it's been one of those things where you come across as almost self-serving if you in the middle of a crisis where focus on how banks should act is on a bigger systemic issues, and you say, well, thanks for addressing the big systemic issue, but there's the little issue in Article 221 where we'd like you to allow for a slightly different risk weight. We're doing it because it's our job, but I think that the regulators at this stage are slightly tone deaf. It's not the issue that they want to address, but they will be forced to once we are in smoother sailing, smoother waters.
Yes, absolutely. I want to ask you a question on the regulatory environment as well, something you tackled early on. And I know you at Invest Europe are working on the responsible investment agenda as well. Is the Green Deal more or less important now with the COVID crisis?
And I think the question, there's a dual answer to that, right? I think the easy and very political answer is that the Green Deal is not off. I mean, if you've seen the political statements by Ursula von der Leyen and by Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, there's a number of people out there saying, once we come back, once we are at the recovery stage, and the European recovery has to be a green recovery. So from a political level, the perspective of sustainable finance and a sustainable approach to financing and to investment is definitely not gone. I think from a prudential level, for a fiduciary obligations, when you look at how do I manage my portfolio, I think I'm sure none of your members, but I think universally there is someone who's taken some very steep lessons about maybe being overly enthusiastic about things that just couldn't carry, and which has then been very, very cumbersome, very expensive lessons learned during this crisis. And I think that goes across the board, but it also goes for some of the overly optimistic, sustainable investments. So I think in the technical, down in the machine room about how will sustainable finance work, I think there are some lessons to be learned from some of the maybe overly enthusiastic and maybe also something you might say just what you call it, greenwashing initiatives that actually holds no substance or holds little substance. That you'll have to take those learning points in. But as a political agenda, I just don't see it going away. Not just because it's politically stated that someone wants it, and the Commission definitely wants it, but also because it's evidently needed. I don't think I don't think you, I, or anyone else is going to say, oh, we don't need that. You might say we need it less for the next 6 months because there are things, more pertinent, putting food on the table, and getting a job. All of that is more pertinent. But none of us are actually going to say that because of Corona crisis, the lesson we learned is that we shouldn't take climate change seriously. So it's a politically will, it's a definite necessity. And then I think, to be honest, I should be careful, right? Because this is an interpretation of very little input, but I have not seen any of those really big investors, like big pension funds, or that they've changed their view on this, right? And I don't think that, and they're not putting their money behind this unless A, it fulfills the fiduciary obligations they have to their pensioners, and B, that they think they can actually benefit from this in the long run. So I've seen that there's some on the greenwashing and some things that are lessons we need to learn, but as a trend and as a commercial necessity, I can't see it going away. And then one should be careful with taking my political predictions I'm looking in a crystal ball, basically, like anyone else here, right? But I think it's a reasonably qualified opinion, or it's just mine.
No, absolutely. It's definitely on the agenda. It has been on the agenda, the topic of the responsible investment, and it will continue to be.
It will be.
It seems that a lot of people are addressing it right now, even more than before, and continues to be an even more hot topic now.
Yeah.
I see we are going ahead of time, but of course, I think we have a few more minutes.
I think the referee can allow for some extra time, given that we had injuries on the way.
What are some of the takeaways for our industry, the venture capital and private equity industry, that came up from the crisis, in your view?
But first, I think we're kind of still in the middle of the crisis. So it's early learning points that we may need to readdress, like 10 weeks or 5 months from now, right? I think one of the first learning points, and it's going to sound as if I'm trying to sell something, but I think one of the first learning points is that people in the capital industry be immensely proud of us, because I think you prove yourself in a crisis, and I think the agility, the ability to actually change your business model, to have that perspective of we're in a crisis and we don't need a plan A or a plan B. We need a spectrum of planning. We need a strategy. We need to maintain. And so I think there's a point of one learning point is just be proud of what we're doing, because this is immensely important for Europe as we move forward, that we have these people who've taken a risk, but also in a very specific crisis situation actually can manage that crisis. So that's maybe, I've only been with Invest Europe for the last 5 months, and there's one of those things where coming into this crisis is one of the learning points that I've taken away. Is like I've worked for people who, some portfolio managers who can look at a portfolio and saying 50% of my portfolio companies are doing nothing. They're just not making any money. And he can still be very cool about it and have a cool head and make the right strategies and still be willing to, next month put the hand on the boilerplate and take an investor's risk, which I think is to me, it's so. One learning point number one is maybe to be proud of what we're doing. I think learning point two is that there's an upside. It's a big dark rain cloud. So there might be the line, but I alluded to it a little bit earlier, that when I've been doing public affairs in Brussels for 10 years, and I've been doing European public affairs for 20 years, right? So the last 10 years I've been doing it in Brussels, and there's been very much sort of a perspective of Europe being over debt financed and over bank financed, and everything has been sort of about how do we make sure that the ecosystem revolving around the banks, how did that survive? And it's still really important because banks is a lifeline also for a number of our members. But I'm this time around, I can just see that, you know, the policymakers, the regulators, everyone is just way more perceptive to that Europe needs to have a well-functioning venture capital, startup, and SME environment, which is a good learning point. I mean, hopefully we will all survive to leverage from that. But I think that's been one of the clear upsides of all the interactions I've had over the last 10 weeks and even before that.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. We at BVCA continue to communicate the added value of the venture capital investment that is obviously a smart investment, right? It comes with also the added value of the networking aspect of the. Of course, our members also join their boards, etc. They become part of the company. So we see more and more. Companies like Philips going towards this particular type of investment because of that.
And maybe a third learning point, but I mean, again, that differs from company to company. But when we were chatting before everything went, you know, the Wi-Fi broke down, I was mentioning to you that I see my board during this crisis way more frequently than I would under normal circumstances. I think that, you know, in a crisis, I hope that, you know, all of your members and all of the companies that they invest in, they've moved closer. I mean, in a crisis, you close ranks, right? So the board moves closer, and you're more hands-on in the management. And actually, I think that connects, that unique connection that you, as a VC or a private equity investor, have with your portfolio companies. As you know, it's not been easy. There's nothing that's been fun about managing this, but you have moved closer to the management and handling this crisis. You have been more insistent on, you know, the strategies and all of that, and that actually, I think, builds a unique tie between, you know, the individual companies and portfolio managers in ways that, you know, you never hope for a crisis, but since it's here. You shouldn't. I think, God, I hate quoting Churchill because everyone does it, but I do think he said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And I think there's one of the things where, you know, investor and management really move closer together, not just in my little association or big association, but also out in the environment, in the real environment.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. We see, as you say, our board members, but also other ecosystem representatives being even more close together and working together more and more in a very coherent together approach. So absolutely, I absolutely agree with you. And I love the optimism in your final words, as I see that we have like 6 minutes left at top. Final question to you, Martin, and thanks again for being part of this online event organized by Trending Topics. Are there any opportunities rather than challenges from this crisis, in your view?
Well, you know, commercially, I'll leave that to others because of course there is. You know, if market is plummeting, but the companies out there is actually healthy. There is from an investor's perspective, but also from a startup perspective, to say, you know, in my niche market as a startup, all the incompetent tossers has been cleaned out of the crisis. Now is the right time for me to start. So yes, there is. It may be early days to say so. From a sort of policy perspective, which is probably the only one I should actually talk about because I don't know about the commercial. But from a policy perspective, I think we've already seen that. I think it's long-term groundwork done by my predecessor and by the national BVCAs and all that. But we will have a recovery plan for Europe, you know, formulated by the European Commission and agree. And that already holds that perspective that we need more startups, we need more innovation. And to have innovation, we need more risk takers, and the best funded risk takers are actually venture capitalists and private equity companies, because that's just in the very DNA of what we do is long-term and active ownership and assessing and taking risks. So I think, you know, again, it sounds a little bit like a political bumper sticker, but there is that, if you want to come quickly out of a crisis, one learning point from a crisis could be, let's be even more careful in the future. And good luck with that, right? Because that's just not going to work, right? But, and I think there's that dawning that what Europe will need, Bulgaria and Belgium and Denmark, where I'm from, is that people who are able to assess risk, take risk, invest their own time, and put the hand on the boilerplate alongside the companies. And also to your point about, sustainable finance. Sustainable finance is not easy. Like making that shift into predicting the future and running the necessary commercial risks to adapt to that, it takes. I think venture capital. I think our industry is uniquely placed to benefit from the recovery that needs to be done.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm a perpetual optimist.
You do sound optimistic, and I completely agree with you. I hope our perhaps the risk appetite would be little in the coming months as we see it, but I absolutely agree with you that it's crucial for supporting good and stellar ideas that bring international champions.
I agree. So,
well,
on that happy note.
On that happy note, I'd like to thank you again for participating, and
thanks for having me.
And we continue our work together, Investor.
I'm looking forward to it. And to the audience, my apologies again for all the Wi-Fi injuries we had during the. But hope you enjoyed nonetheless. It's been a pleasure, Maria. Right.
It's been
thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.